Building websites is a breeze with the framework as you please, easy as slicing cheese with the tools such as these. Structured pages quick, no CSS to make you sick. Use the layout that you pick, navigation helps you click. Icons, buttons, you can tap your containers, close the gap. Responsive gridding is a snap. You'll be launching off the map, blasting off with Bootstrap, blasting off with Bootstrap.
Welcome back to Level 2 of Blasting Off with Bootstrap. This is Section 1, Thinking in Grids. So here's our site so far. We have learned how, by adding a class of container to our wrapper element, we've added some structure to our content. But our site is still looking very vertical. Every element shows up as a new row on our page. How can we work with Bootstrap to position things so that they show up and we use more of our horizontal space? If we take a little bit closer look at our page, we can visualize our content elements as being grouped into horizontal rows. First, we could take a look at the H1 tag, the part with blasting off with Bootstrap, as its own row of data. Next, the H2 tag, combined with its paragraph and buttons, those can make up another row of data. Lastly, our H3 tags, each with the H3 and a paragraph, they could each be a row of data. So you could think of this page as having 5 distinct rows of data on it. If rows are a horizontal grouping of data, columns are a vertical grouping. If we take a look at our site right now, we can see there's really only one column. Everything flows down the page right after the previous element. If our page is only one column, we won't be able to use much of the horizontal space. The way that Bootstrap helps us solve this problem is by dividing our page into 12 columns that we can use as needed. Currently, each of our rows of data is using all of these columns, since we're not specifying otherwise. What would it look like if some of our elements on the page only used some of these columns? Let's take a look at the visual goal for our page at the end of this section. Next, let's split our page up into the 12 columns that Bootstrap provides for us. Let's take a look at all the elements on the page and see how many columns each of them take up. To start with, let's look at the H1. Here, our title spans 12 columns. Below that, we have our H2 and our paragraph and button area, and then we have this image that we added. Each of these two elements spans 6 columns. Towards the bottom of our page, you can see our H3 tags and their corresponding paragraphs. Well, each of them take up 4 columns. So what do all of these have in common? Well, if you add up the number of columns in every row, it always equals 12. If we were to wireframe our grid design, it might look a little like this. We have our 12-column header, our 2 6-column main sections, and then our 3 4-column features. Remember, each row of data adds up to use all 12 columns in each of these cases. In order to do this, we'll need to limit the number of columns that each of our elements can use. We can use Bootstrap's call MD star classes, and we can denote the number of columns each of our elements takes up. The MD in this class name, that represents a medium-sized screen, like on a laptop. We'll explore some other screen sizes later on, but MD is a good starting point for creating your grid. To start, we know our H1 tag is going to span all 12 columns. So what we'll need to do is wrap our H1 in an element that has a class of call MD12. If we wanted to wrap an element that took up half of the page, we could use a similar class of call MD6 to span 6 columns. Similarly, if we only wanted to use 4 columns, we could just use call MD4. Let's take a look at our code so far. Here we have our H1 tag. That's the one that we want to span all 12 columns. We'll need to wrap our H1 tag in another div that has a class of call MD12. If we look at this in a browser now, we can see our H1 tag is now taking up all 12 columns. What about our H2 and this blasting off image that we added? Well, we want the H2, the paragraph, and the buttons to be in 6 columns, and then we want the image to be in another 6 columns. As you might expect, we'll need to wrap our H2, our paragraph, and our buttons in a div, and we'll need to wrap our image in a div. Since we want both of these to take up 6 columns, we're going to add a class of callMD6 to each of them. So you can probably see a pattern developing here. When we want to create a column of data, we usually wrap it in an element and add some class to it. Let's try that on these last couple of elements. So for our featured items, we want each of them to span 4 columns. Similar to before, we'll need to wrap each of our features in another div. Then we can add a class of callMD4 to it to make each of them use 4 columns. Alright, so let's take a look at this in the browser now. If we open it up, we can see we're using a lot more of the horizontal space. Our H1 takes up the entire page, our features are each taking up 4 columns, and our image and our lead both show up using half of the page, with only adding a couple of classes. If we take a look back at our HTML, we can see it's a little bit hard to read. If we're just looking at this, it's really hard to tell which elements are appearing on which rows without doing a little bit of math. What can we do to clean this up and make it obvious? Turns out, Bootstrap has a class that will help us fix up our code in just this way, called the row class. Within each row, you'll see that the number of columns added here, it always equals 12. By adding this row class, we've added a bit of smart styling to our row, and we've also let Bootstrap know to expect a grid within that element. You'll want to make sure that the number of columns within a row never exceeds 12. If we take a look at our page in the browser, you'd see it looks almost the same as it did before, but we're actually using a little bit more of the screen thanks to these rows. Our HTML is also a lot easier to read. So far, the number of columns in each row has added up to 12. But what about if it didn't? Let's see what would happen if we changed one of these elements to instead take up 5 columns. If you add these up together, you'll see it now equals 13 columns. How would this look in the browser? If we check this out in the browser, it probably doesn't look like you'd expect. Our rocket bus element didn't have enough space on the first row, so instead it jumped down to the second one. This is very similar to how our page was structured before we started using rows. When designing with grids, we're not limited to elements that span equal number of columns like 6, 6 and 4, 4, 4. One very popular proportion for sites is 9 columns and 3 columns. So here's what that would look like. You'll see this ratio quite often for blogs that have a sidebar. So far, the elements in each row were very close to each other. There wasn't much padding between them. What if we wanted to do something like this, where we had an entire column of padding between our blog, let's say, and our sidebar? Using what we know so far, one way to do this might be to create an empty column. We could do that by creating another div and giving it a class of callMD1. Now, between our main content in that callMD8 and our sidebar in the callMD3 is going to be an empty column. Although this would work, there is a better way. Bootstrap provides a class that we can use to offset our elements by a given number of columns. So in this case, we can get rid of that callMD1 element and instead add a class of callMDOffset1 to our sidebar. What this would do is add a column of padding to the left of our 3-column sidebar. This star here, that could be anything from 0 to 12, and it'll add that many columns of padding to the left side of the element. Let's take a look at an example website from the Bootstrap webpage using this technique. This Bootstrap blog illustrates the concept we were just talking about. So if you take a look at it, there's 8 columns of content, 1 column of offset, and then another 3 columns for the sidebar. That's it for section 1. It's time for you to try thinking in grids in the challenges, and I'll see you back in section 2.